My neighbor mocked my old farm. He didn't laugh when the surveyor arrived. I never thought my neighbor would steal from me. I've lived on my family's farm for 37 years, watching the seasons change the fields from green to gold and back again. After my father passed away 3 years ago, the land started looking tired. The barn needed paint, the fences sagged in places, and weeds claimed the unused corners. My neighbor, Calvin Brooks, noticed everything. He was a real estate developer with sharp suits and a sharper tongue. Every time he drove past, he'd shake his head like he pitied me. At town meetings, he'd joke about buying me out. When I finally give up on that place, people would chuckle and I'd pretend not to hear. But I heard everything. Calvin had money, connections, and confidence that filled every room he entered. Meanwhile, I had dirt under my fingernails and a bank account that made me wince. Still, something my father told me echoed in my mind during those hard months. Never argue with fools. Let time embarrass them. I didn't know it then, but time was about to prove him right. The community barbecue happened on a Saturday in June. The whole town showed up at the park, carrying potato salad and gossip in equal measure. I stood near the grill, flipping burgers, when Calvin arrived with his real estate agent, a blonde woman named Cheryl who laughed too loud at everything he said. They worked the crowd like politicians, shaking hands and making promises. Then Calvin spotted me. He walked over with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey there!" he called out loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "How's that dying patch of dirt holding up?" People turned to look. Some laughed nervously. Others just stared at their paper plates. I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I kept my face calm. "Still standing," I replied quietly. Calvin chuckled and patted my shoulder like I was a child. "Give it time, friend. Give it time." As he walked away, I heard him tell Cheryl, "That rotting relic won't last another winter." I gripped the spatula tighter and said nothing. 2 weeks later, Calvin showed up at my door with Cheryl beside him. They wore sunglasses even though it was overcast. "Got a minute?" Calvin asked, already stepping onto my porch without waiting for an answer. I let them into my kitchen, where dirty dishes sat in the sink and flies buzzed near the window. Cheryl's nose wrinkled. Calvin didn't waste time. He pulled out a folder with papers inside. "I'm prepared to offer you $40,000 for this property," he said, sliding the papers across my table. "That's generous, considering the condition." I looked at the number. My land was easily worth 3 times that amount, maybe more. "The barn's an eyesore," Calvin continued. "You'll thank me when I bulldoze it and put something modern here." His confidence amazed me. He truly believed I'd sign away my family's legacy for pennies. "I'll think about it," I said, which was a polite way of saying no. Calvin's smile tightened. "Don't think too long," he warned. "Offers like this don't last forever." After they left, I sat at that same kitchen table feeling defeated. My father's face kept appearing in my mind, the way he looked at this land like it was sacred. I decided to go through his old papers in the attic, something I'd been avoiding since his funeral. Dust covered everything up there. Boxes were stacked against the walls, labeled in his shaky handwriting. I opened one marked important documents and found insurance papers, tax records, and faded photographs. Then, at the bottom, I found a manila envelope sealed with tape that had turned yellow. Written across it in red ink, "Surveyor, 1973. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the property, notes in my father's handwriting, and copies of correspondence with someone named Harold Cole. One note stood out: "Boundary dispute with Brooks property. See attached survey." I spread the papers across the attic floor and stared. My father had known something. He'd documented something important, and I'd almost thrown it away. If you're enjoying this story so far, please take a moment to like this story and also hit the subscribe button to get notified of our new series. The next morning, I walked my property line with the old map in my hand. The summer sun beat down on my neck as I counted fence posts and measured distances with my boots. When I reached the eastern border where my land met Calvin's, I stopped cold. His new fence, the one he'd installed 6 months ago claiming routine maintenance, cut deep into my side. I paced it out. 50 feet, maybe more, of my land sat on his side of that fence. His cattle grazed there. His new equipment shed sat right in the middle of what should have been my field. I remembered the day he'd installed it. He'd told me the property line had shifted over the years, and that he was just correcting an old mistake. Like a fool, I'd believed him. I trusted my neighbor because that's what you did in small towns. You trusted people. My stomach turned as I realized the truth. Calvin hadn't made a mistake. He'd stolen from me deliberately, betting I was too poor and too tired to fight back. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was how everyone in town sided with Calvin without question. At the hardware store, the owner asked me when I was finally going to sell that dump. At church, people whispered when I walked past. Calvin sponsored the youth baseball team, donated to the food bank, and threw Christmas parties at his big house on the hill. Meanwhile, I was just the bitter old farmer who couldn't keep up with the times. The humiliation burned worse than any physical pain. But I didn't lash out. I didn't confront anyone. Instead, I started taking photographs of everything. I documented every fence post, every marker, every inch of that disputed border. I took notes with dates and times. I measured distances and recorded them in a notebook I kept hidden in my truck. People thought I was walking my land out of sadness, surveying what I was about to lose. They had no idea I was building a case. Sometimes the best revenge isn't loud. Sometimes it's silent, careful, and absolutely devastating. I spent 3 days researching Harold Cole, the surveyor who'd worked with my father in 1973. I found his obituary online dated 2019. But the obituary mentioned a son named Stephen Cole who'd taken over his father's surveying business. I found the company website, Cole and Associates Land Surveying. The office was 2 towns over, about 40 minutes from my farm. I called on a Thursday afternoon. A woman answered, and I asked to speak with Stephen Cole. Regarding what? She asked. A boundary survey from 1973, I said. My father worked with Harold Cole on a property dispute. There was a pause. Then she said, "Hold please." 2 minutes later, a man's voice came on the line. "This is Stephen Cole." I explained who I was and mentioned my father's name. Another pause, longer this time. "I remember my dad talking about that case," Stephen finally said. "The Brooks boundary dispute. It was tricky." My heart hammered. "Would you be willing to recheck the property?" I asked. "For old time's sake?" Stephen was quiet, then said, "Let me look into it. I'll call you back." Stephen called me back the next morning. "I found my father's old files," he said. He kept detailed records of that survey. According to his notes, there was significant disagreement about where the boundary actually fell. We talked for 20 minutes. Stephen explained how property lines worked, how county records could be verified, and how surveys from decades ago were still legally valid if properly documented. "My dad was thorough," Stephen said with pride in his voice. "If he marked something in 1973, you can bet it was accurate." He offered to come out and resurvey the property, comparing his father's original work with current conditions. "I'll do it at cost," he added. "My dad always talked about your father with respect, said he was an honest man in a difficult situation." I scheduled the appointment for the following week. After hanging up, I sat in my kitchen staring at nothing. For the first time in months, I felt something other than defeat. I felt hope, and underneath that hope, I felt something sharper. The beginning of justice. Stephen arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 assistants and equipment that looked expensive. Calvin wasn't home, I checked. We started at the original survey markers from 1973, old iron posts buried in the ground that I'd forgotten existed. Stephen's team set up tripods and instruments that beeped and flashed. They took measurements, compared GPS coordinates to the original survey, and consulted maps spread across the hood of their truck. I followed them silently, my heart pounding every time Stephen frowned or made a note. After 3 hours, we reached Calvin's fence. Stephen stopped walking. He stared at the fence line, then at his equipment, then back at the fence. "That fence isn't just off," he said quietly. "It's way off. One of his assistants whistled low. "How far?" I asked, though my mouth had gone dry. Stephen pulled out a measuring tape and walked the line. "I need to confirm with the official survey, but preliminary? That fence is on your property. Significantly on your property." He looked at me with something like sympathy. "Has this been here long?" 3 days later, Stephen sent me his preliminary report via email. I printed it out and read it 5 times, making sure I understood every word. The numbers were clear. Calvin's pasture expansion included 11.7 acres of my land. 11.7 acres. That was almost a tenth of my total property. My hands shook as I calculated what that land was worth. At current market rates, over $200,000. Calvin had stolen from me and then offered to buy the rest for $40,000. The nerve of it made me dizzy. Stephen's report included overlaid maps showing the original boundary in red and Calvin's fence in blue. The difference was impossible to ignore. His equipment shed, his new barn extension, even part of his paved driveway sat on my side of the legal line. Stephen's note at the bottom read, "The original county plat and survey records support this finding. The boundary never changed. All improvements on your side of the line legally belong to you." I sat at my kitchen table until dark, reading that sentence over and over, letting the reality sink in. If this story is keeping you hooked, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button so you never miss our next thrilling series. I called Stephen to confirm. "Are you absolutely certain?" I asked. "Could there be any mistake?" He was patient with my questions. "The county records are crystal clear," he explained. "Your father's original deed, the 1973 survey, the plat maps, they all align perfectly. The property line is exactly where my father marked it 52 years ago. It hasn't moved an inch." He paused, then added, "Mr. Brooks had no legal basis to move that fence. By law, everything on your side of the true boundary belongs to you." I thanked him and hung up. For a long moment, I just sat there, letting the enormity of it wash over me. Calvin had gambled that I was too ignorant and too defeated to question him. He'd counted on my weakness, but he'd forgotten something important. Even weak men have breaking points, and past that breaking point they become dangerous. I pulled out my notebook and started making a list. Names, dates, evidence, witnesses. I wasn't going to rush this. I was going to do it right. Every instinct in me wanted to march to Calvin's house and scream in his face. I imagined throwing Stephen's report on his dining table and watching his smug expression crumble. I imagined the satisfaction of seeing him realize he'd been caught. But I didn't do it. I'd spent enough time on Reddit reading revenge stories to know the truth. The quiet ones always land harder. The public ones give your enemy time to prepare, to spin stories, to play victim. So instead, I swallowed my rage and made a different plan. I contacted Julia Morris, a lawyer I'd gone to high school with who now practiced property law in the city. We'd lost touch over the years, but when I explained my situation, she got excited. "This is textbook property theft," she said. "And you have documentation? Actual surveys?" When I sent her Stephen's report, she called me back within an hour. "This is airtight," she said. "We can absolutely pursue this." Over the next 2 weeks, we built my case. Julia was methodical, requesting county records, verifying Stephen's survey against official plats, and documenting every improvement Calvin had made on my land. I started gathering evidence like my life depended on it. I borrowed a drone from my nephew and flew it over the disputed boundary, taking hundreds of photographs from every angle. The images clearly showed Calvin's fence cutting across the surveyed line, his barn sitting on my property, his cattle grazing on my grass. I printed everything and organized it in a 3-ring binder with tabs and labels. Julia helped me create a timeline. When Calvin moved the fence, when I'd questioned him, his response, the lies he'd told. We gathered witness statements from the old hardware store owner who remembered my father complaining about the boundary dispute in the 1970s. We pulled permits Calvin had filed for his barn extension, permits that listed coordinates that were legally on my land. The file grew thicker every day. Julia labeled it boundary theft evidence and kept it in her office safe. "This is better than most cases I've seen," she told me. Most property disputes are messy, with unclear records. Yours is crystal clear. He's going to lose. The certainty in her voice made me believe it too. 2 weeks later, the town held its monthly community meeting. I attended like I always did, sitting in the back row of the courthouse meeting room. Calvin was there, of course, holding court near the front. The mayor asked if anyone had new business. Calvin stood up, all smiles and confidence. I wanted to share some exciting news, he announced. I've finalized plans to develop the corner of my farm into luxury cottage sites. It'll bring tourism, jobs, and revenue to our community. People clapped. The mayor beamed. Calvin went on about his vision. Upscale cabins, a small restaurant, maybe even a spa. He had architectural drawings that he passed around. I saw the location marked on his map, right in the middle of my 11.7 acres. My stolen land was going to make him rich while I struggled to pay my electric bill. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, saying nothing. A woman next to me whispered, "Must be hard watching him succeed." I just smiled. 1 week later, Calvin received a certified letter from Julia's law firm. I know because Julia called me the moment the delivery was confirmed. "It's done," she said. "He's officially been served." The letter was formal and devastating. It informed Calvin that he was in unlawful possession of 11.7 acres belonging to me. It cited the original survey, the county records, and current verification. It demanded immediate cessation of all use of the disputed property and warned that legal action would follow if he didn't comply. It included copies of Stephen's survey and photographs of the fence line. Julia had drafted it to sound professional but unmistakably threatening. "He'll probably ignore it," Julia warned me. "Guys like him always think they can talk their way out of trouble." I nodded, though she couldn't see me. "Let him ignore it," I said quietly. "That just makes what comes next easier." That night I barely slept. I kept imagining Calvin opening that envelope, his face changing as he read the words. By morning, my imagination wouldn't be necessary. Calvin showed up at my farm before 9 o'clock the next morning. I was feeding my chickens when his truck roared up my driveway, spraying gravel. He jumped out, red-faced and waving papers. "What is this?" he shouted, storming toward me. "What kind of game are you playing?" I straightened up slowly, meeting his eyes. "It's not a game, Calvin. That land is mine." He laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're bluffing. That land has been part of my property for months. You never said a word." I stayed calm. "I'm saying something now. You need to vacate my property." His face darkened. "You can't afford lawyers. You can barely afford to keep this place running. You think some dusty old papers are going to change anything?" There it was, the contempt he'd always felt but rarely showed this directly. "The county surveyor is coming next week," I said quietly. "Official markers will be placed. You should probably prepare yourself." He stared at me like I was speaking another language. Then he laughed again, though there was uncertainty in his eyes now. "You're making a huge mistake," he said, pointing at me. "Huge." Then he got in his truck and left. The county surveyor arrived the following Tuesday, accompanied by 2 sheriff's deputies and Stephen Cole as a consulting expert. Word had spread somehow. Small towns have no secrets, and neighbors started gathering along the road to watch. Calvin came out of his house looking pale but defiant. The county surveyor, a serious woman named Patricia Reeves, didn't waste time with pleasantries. "We're here to verify and mark the legal boundary between these 2 properties," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. She had official documents, GPS equipment, and Stephen's original survey for reference. For 3 hours, they worked methodically down the property line, installing bright orange survey markers every 50 feet. Each marker was metal with official county stamps. Permanent, legal, undeniable. The line cut straight through Calvin's fence, crossed his pasture, and then, to the amazement of everyone watching, it ran right through the corner of his renovated barn. Calvin's face went from red to white to gray. "That's impossible," he kept saying. But the markers didn't lie. Neither did the measurements, the GPS coordinates, or the historical records. "This is getting intense," Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. Patricia Reeves pointed at Calvin's barn with her clipboard. According to county records and verified survey data, this structure sits primarily on property belonging to the plaintiff. She meant me. I was the plaintiff now. Calvin sputtered protests, but Patricia cut him off. The legal boundary is clear, Mr. Brooks. This isn't a negotiation. One of the deputies stepped forward. Ma'am, what does this mean practically speaking? Patricia consulted her papers. Practically speaking, any permanent structures on the wrong side of the boundary line belong to the legal property owner. In this case, approximately 80% of this barn sits on the plaintiff's land. My barn. Calvin had spent $50,000 renovating that barn last year. He told everyone at the hardware store, complaining about costs and bragging about the final product. And now it was mine. Calvin looked at me with something I'd never seen in his eyes before. Fear. You can't do this, he whispered. But I could. And I was. That's my barn now, I said quietly, just loud enough for him to hear. The deputies heard it too. So did the neighbors. The story would be all over town by dinner.
Calvin filed a lawsuit 3 days later, claiming adverse possession, arguing that he'd improved the land in good faith and demanding that the boundary be adjusted to match his fence line. Julia had predicted it. Guys like him never go quietly, she'd said. But we were ready. Calvin hired an expensive lawyer from the city, a man with gray hair and an expensive watch. They came to the preliminary hearing confident, armed with photographs of Calvin's improvements and testimony about how long the fence had been there. Then Julia presented our evidence. She showed the court the original 1973 survey. She showed county plat maps. She showed Calvin's own permit applications that contradicted his current claims. She showed the drone footage, the dated photographs, and Stephen's expert testimony. The judge, an older woman named Harriet Blackwell, listened to both sides with a neutral expression. Then she asked Calvin's lawyer a simple question: do you have any evidence that the property boundary changed between 1973 and now? Silence. Because the plaintiff has provided extensive documentation that it did not. More silence. Judge Blackwell didn't even take long to decide. The land belongs to the defendant, she said, meaning me. Case dismissed. But the ruling didn't stop there. Judge Blackwell continued, furthermore, Mr. Brooks is ordered to vacate the plaintiff's property within 60 days. All structures built on the plaintiff's land become property of the plaintiff. Mr. Brooks is additionally ordered to pay damages for trespass and unauthorized use of the property over the past 7 months. Julia squeezed my arm. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Calvin sat frozen in his chair. His lawyer tried to object, but Judge Blackwell shut him down. Counselor, your client knowingly moved a fence onto his neighbor's property and then constructed improvements there. Whether through ignorance or malice, the result is the same. The law is clear. She banged her gavel. 60 days, Mr. Brooks. I suggest you use them wisely. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the local paper tried to interview Calvin. He pushed past them without speaking. I gave a brief statement: I'm just glad the truth came out. My father always said land doesn't lie. That quote would be the headline in the next day's paper. Calvin's world was crumbling, and mine was being rebuilt brick by brick. The public fallout was spectacular. Within days, everyone in town knew the story. The smartest man in town, the real estate developer who'd mocked my dying farm, had been exposed as a thief. At the coffee shop, people who'd laughed at Calvin's jokes now called him a crook and a bully. His luxury cottage development fell apart immediately. Investors pulled out, citing concerns about Mr. Brooks' business practices. The bank that had pre-approved his construction loan froze the funds pending review. Even his sponsors dropped him. The youth baseball team found a new donor, and the food bank quietly removed his name from their website. I saw him once during this period, at the gas station. He looked 10 years older, his confidence replaced by something that looked like shame. He avoided my eyes. I didn't gloat or say anything cruel. I just pumped my gas and left. The revenge wasn't in confrontation. It was in watching his empire crumble while mine was being restored. That was sweeter than any words could have been. My father was right, time embarrasses fools. Calvin's financial situation got worse. The court-ordered damages, plus his legal fees, plus the loan payments on his improvements, it all became too much. He was forced to sell part of his property to cover costs. The auction was held on a cool October morning at the courthouse steps. I attended with Julia. Calvin's 75 acres were divided into 3 parcels. The auctioneer described each one, noting the excellent development potential and prime location. When the bidding started on the parcel adjacent to my eastern boundary, I raised my hand. Several other people bid too, but I kept going. The final price was $58,000, exactly $18,000 more than Calvin had offered me for my entire farm. When the auctioneer's gavel fell, I owned an additional 23 acres of prime land. The irony was perfect. I'd paid half what it was worth because Calvin's reputation had tanked the value. As I signed the paperwork, I saw Calvin watching from across the street. He didn't approach me. He just stood there, hands in pockets, watching everything he'd built fall apart. The community's attitude toward me changed overnight. People who'd whispered behind my back now showed up at my door with casseroles and apologies. "We should have listened to you," the hardware store owner said, looking embarrassed. Calvin had us all fooled. The youth baseball coach asked if I'd consider sponsoring the team. The mayor invited me to join the town planning committee. I accepted some invitations and politely declined others. I wasn't interested in becoming the new Calvin, powerful and connected but ultimately hollow. I just wanted to work my land in peace. But I'd be lying if I said the validation didn't feel good. For years, people had treated me like a failure, like someone to be pitied or mocked. Now they saw me as someone who'd stood up for himself and won. At church, the pastor mentioned the importance of standing for truth during his sermon, and several people glanced my way. I kept my eyes forward, but inside, I smiled. Sometimes being right is its own reward. With the settlement money and my expanded property, I finally had resources to fix everything. I hired contractors to restore the barn Calvin had built, my barn now, painting it red with white trim like my father's original. I repainted the farmhouse, fixed the sagging fences, and cleared the weeds from the fields. I bought new equipment, hired seasonal help, and planted cover crops on the additional acreage. The farm was coming back to life. On the day the work finished, I stood at the front gate and hammered in a new sign I'd commissioned. The wood was fresh cedar, and the letters were carved deep, surveyed, secured, and stronger than ever. Neighbors driving past honked and waved. Some stopped to take pictures. The local paper ran a feature article with the headline, "Local Farmer Reclaims Heritage Property." They interviewed me in front of the barn, and I talked about my father, about perseverance, and about how land remembers the truth even when people forget. That sign became a landmark in our area. People gave directions based on it: turn left at the surveyed sign. Months passed. Winter came and went, then spring arrived with green shoots and warm rain. I was working in the garden one Saturday morning when I heard a truck on the road. I glanced up and saw Calvin's vehicle driving slowly past my property. He'd sold most of his land by then, keeping only his house and a few acres around it. He'd taken a job managing someone else's properties, a humbling fall for a man who'd once owned hundreds of acres. I straightened up, wiping dirt from my hands. Our eyes met across the distance. For a moment, I thought about waving, maybe even offering some gesture of reconciliation. But then I remembered his smirk at the barbecue, his insulting offer, his confident theft. I raised my hand and waved politely. A neighborly wave. A wave that said I'd won. Calvin looked at me for a long moment. Then he turned away and kept driving. He didn't wave back. I returned to my garden, smiling. My father used to say something during those old boundary disputes, something I'd remembered during the darkest days of humiliation and doubt. His words had carried me through, and now they felt like prophecy: land doesn't mock. It remembers. And my land had remembered everything.